videos over the last 6 months, I've been charting a course through all of the various Star Trek lines and waves from Asylum / Diamond Select. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the final line from this initial phase of Star Trek figures from Asylum before the license officially became a Diamond Select Toys product. Now, whilst the Star Trek lines from Asylum have definitely been a mixed bag with some very serious highs and some lows, one of my main criticisms of this Asylum era has been the lack of enemies or aliens that have been produced as part of any of the lines. The original series probably fared the best with the most number of different aliens in that line, and likewise Enterprise had a fair share of aliens too. But it's really the Next Generation era, including Deep Space Nine, that really lacked and really felt neglected when it came to aliens. However, one alien they did invest in quite heavily by producing an entire wave dedicated to them was the Borg. And they produced this Borg Assimilation line of 3 figures. The packaging for this line is significantly different. We can see it's all stylized as if it is a Borg alcove. I really quite like this approach. The sort of metal frame effect is quite nicely done. We can see the green of the alcove behind the figure, and I do like the green logo for the Borg at the top of the packaging there, and that is consistent throughout, which I think is nicely done. And when we flip the reverse of the packaging, we can see again that sort of Borg, the sort of technology enhanced, the chips, the sort of intermeshing of technology with that green highlighting really sums up what we think of as the Borg. It's like the exterior of a Borg cube, and we have that logo that we see of the Borg in the Next Generation, which is a sort of hand symbol. I've never quite understood how this represents the Borg particularly well, but nevertheless that is the one that was associated with the Borg, at least in the TV show. And we see this symbol again on the coin on the side of the packaging, which you can remove. I'm not quite sure why this series of figures came with a coin, or virtually all the Asylum releases did have one. I've never really understood why, to be honest, because it's not like chips or currency is something that's really associated with Star Trek at all. So it's always been a bit of a mystery for me why these were included with them. So the first thing to notice when you take these out of the packaging is that Articulation have definitely taken a little bit of creative license when it comes to these Borg. On screen, the Borg have 2 major looks. There's their initial appearance from episodes in the Next Generation where they look more like this. There's a more simplistic design, more emphasis on wires and tubing and sort of pasty white faces. And then there's this second, probably more distinctive look, what people associate with the Borg, which comes from their update that they were given in First Contact and would later appear in Voyager and Enterprise. There's definitely a greater emphasis on the idea of technology being integrated into the body in these Borg, less wires and more sort of circuitry. And of course we can see even in the skin there's veins that are filled with nanobots and things like that. So they have a much more disturbing look. Asylum seems to have taken their cue from this second look, but amped it up even more, so it looks even more exaggerated and even more threatening. They're bigger, they're bulkier, and they look a lot more hostile. We also see a strong return to tubing as well on these figures, so we can see some big chunky tubes that are rubber that go into the side of the head on this figure, for example, and work with the articulation, and it looks pretty good, I have to say. I think the head sculpt in particular are very, very nicely rendered. Each one is a different alien, so in this case, of course, we have a Cardassian who has been assimilated by the Borg. I think this is a fantastic head sculpt. I really think it looks really menacing and creepy, and I think it's interesting that we do finally get a Cardassian. It's just as a Borg. The bodies are really well sculpted, and each one is unique. As we can see here, there's all sorts of rivets and grooves and piping and bits and pieces of wiring and who knows what in terms of technology going on, and I think it's really inventive, and I've done a really fantastic job that it all fits together and looks fairly seamless, and the paint wash really complements this sculpt, so it brings out all that detailing. There's greys, there's blacks running through it, even some bits of gold and silver, and I think it looks really, really good. And there's nice detailing on the hands as well, where we can see those individual wires going up to the knuckles, very nicely painted, and overall it looks like solid stuff. And then we come on to the second sort of gun arm, for lack of a better description, where this is just technology gone wild. And again, we're seeing here, this is where the creative license has been taken quite liberally for them to do whatever they wanted, and it is mostly impressive, but it does feel quite exaggerated, it does feel quite hyper-real. It certainly doesn't match anything that we really see on screen, and that would be my criticism of this line as a whole, is that they seem to have just gone a little bit too far with their imagination, so that it kind of loses touch with the source material. But all that being said, I do like the fact that some of these pieces, these individual bits of knives and wires, are actually articulated. There's a little bit of extra thought there, and it makes the figure a bit more fun. And again, the very intricate sculpting runs right through the legs, right down into the feet, which are each one is completely unique, and it looks really good. This is solid stuff, very nicely painted and interesting to look at. In terms of the articulation scheme, it is pretty much what we would expect from this line. The head is on a ball joint, which allows the head to move from side to side. It doesn't really allow movement up or down, although it does wobble a little bit in that direction. He's got ball jointed shoulders, and of course there is that complementary bicep swivel there, which is pretty cool. Works quite well here. And then he's got this single jointed elbow. Now obviously wherever there's a hand, there is a swivel at the hand as well, but not so much on these big gun arms. He does have a ball joint in their chest, so he can look up and down a little bit, and you can tilt him from side to side, which is pretty good, but it does seem to be a little bit of resistance, a bit of pressure that ends up forcing the figure back into its default forward facing position. The legs at the hips are on a straightforward swivel, so they just kick forwards, they don't really kick back at all. There's a single jointed knee, which bends to about 90 degrees, and then there's another hinge at the ankle, so again, the foot does arc forwards and backwards, but not side to side. Overall, I really quite like this Cardassian Borg. I think of all of the figures in this wave, he is probably the most streamlined, the most slim. He's probably the closest to what we see on screen, as the others just seem to get bulkier as we go along. But I really love the expression on this face. It's really menacing, and he's very, very creepy, especially with those various knives and bits and pieces on the end of his gun arm. Next up, we have the Hirogen Hunter Borg, which is a pretty cool representation from Voyager, because of course we never got any figures in the Asylum line from that series. So this is especially welcome. I think they've done a very nice job of that head sculpt. Gives you an idea of what you might have got if they'd explored some of the Delta Quadrant aliens in a Voyager series. But this is, again, very nicely done. Obviously completely unique, very different to what we saw in the Cardassian figure. Everything about this figure just feels different. So I think they've done a very nice job of the head sculpt overall. Again, we can see a big tube coming out the very base of the skull there into the back, which is quite cool and quite creepy looking. This time around in the body mold, we can see obviously this is completely unique, this is very different to what we've seen previously, and there's obviously greater emphasis on this sort of armour that he has. He's got these big shoulder pads which are articulated, they can move up and down to support the articulation, which is great, but we can see there's just a lot more going on here. This definitely feels more like armour than what we've previously seen, more so than circuitry. But again, right the way around this sculpt, we can just see so much detail, very fine paint apps as well. We can see actually a bit of brown this time as well to highlight some of these features, and it just looks very authentic, looks very lived in. It's just a fantastic paint job, and like I said, it really emphasises the fantastic sculpt that we have here. Again, one arm is given over to have a sort of more humanoid arm hand that we can see there, so it's more of a gauntlet. It looks pretty good, very different to what we saw on the Cardassian, whereas that was more flesh-toned. This one is definitely encased in a gauntlet, a glove effect, and looks pretty good. And this time around, the Hirogen's gum is on the opposite arm, and yeah, I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at, to be honest. I've never seen anything like this, certainly not on screen. It's big, it's bulky, it looks very technologically advanced and quite threatening. Although this time around there are no moving pieces, nothing is articulated, nothing really happens with this. But he makes up for that in this strange bit of extra articulation where he has this lifting panel. Now, it doesn't seem to serve any particular function other than to hide his lower abdomen. It's cool to have it, but I'm not quite sure why we've got it. Since it doesn't hinder or support articulation, it seems unnecessary, but like I said, glad to have a little bit of extra feature going on in the figure. I think that's kind of cool. And then finally, the legs are much more in proportion, as we can see, completely different to what we saw with the Cardassian. No denying that everything is unique on each of these figures. Each sculpt is individual. The articulation scheme is exactly the same as we've seen before. Although the figure looks very different, it does operate and move in the same way. The only thing I want to highlight really was the neck, which is on obviously a ball joint, and the neck is a much thicker piece. There's definitely stronger resistance to moving this about, but you do get a lot more articulation out of it. He can really bend his head forwards and backwards a lot more, but as I said, there's a lot of that rubber resistance. And as I said, for anyone who's worried about the articulation when it comes to the ball jointed shoulders, because of those shoulder pads, you don't need to worry because they do move to support it. Although they don't go quite as high up as I might like, it's still pretty good. So I think with this figure, there's definitely more creative license on display. We can see he's a lot more exaggerated than we just saw with the Cardassian. He's got those big shoulder pads. There's definitely more a sense of armour. He's more of a warrior class, I suppose, for the Borg. I'm not sure they have those, but let's pretend they do for now. He's definitely bigger and bulkier, and he is quite heavy as well. And then finally we have the Klingon, and once again we can see that despite all being of a type, they are all completely unique and very different and individual. Once again, we have a very nice head sculpt. I think we can clearly see that this is obviously a Klingon, or has been in a past life, and then we have all those wires coming out the side of his face. We have those nice eyepieces going over one eye as well, and this looks very menacing and very, very well done. In terms of the body mold, the Klingon feels as if he's halfway between the Cardassian and the Hirogen when it comes to that sort of armour effect. He definitely feels more armoured up. He's got the shoulder pads which move to support the articulation, which make him look a bit bulkier, but he doesn't seem quite as exaggerated as the Hirogen. He doesn't seem quite as bulky somehow, and yet there is still the same level of detail in the sculpting. I quite like with the Klingon that we actually have that sort of classic Klingon spine still in the body piece, which is kind of cool, and of course it's very, very well painted. Once again, one arm is left for a humanoid hand effect, whilst the other is given over to a gun arm. The hand is once again encased in a sort of gauntlet glove effect, which is very nicely sculpted. It looks lots of wires and detail, and again the paint apps are very nice. We can see some of the bronze sort of copper wiring going through it, which looks very nice. Meanwhile, the gun arm again is quite exaggerated. This big bulky thing, lots of big chunky rubber wires coming out of this and moving all over the place. Again, no idea what this is. It definitely has more of an effect of a claw arm, like a grabbing arm, as we can see that this end piece is actually a little bit articulated, so we can open it and close it to effect as well, which I quite like. So really, it's left to your imagination as to what this is or what it does, but it certainly looks threatening. And then finally the legs, once again completely unique, very different. Just look at the feet, for example, and those shins. They're completely different to what we see in the other figures, and I think that's one of the greatest things about this line, is that each one does feel very distinctive. Ironically for the Borg, who love to homogenise, each one does have its own character, which I think is cool. And once again, the articulation scheme is the same as we've seen on the previous two figures, so I won't go through all of it again, but we can see, obviously, with that ball-jointed head, the Klingon fares pretty well with this articulation. He can look up and down and side to side, and there's less resistance than with the other figures, so you probably get the best posability in the neck from this guy. And as previously pointed out, the shoulder pads do move to support the shoulder articulation as well, so very grateful for this, and this works very well without compromising the articulation, which is great. So once again, we have a very distinctive Borg, and I really like that this one's based on a Klingon as well, which is pretty cool. So I think overall they've done a very, very nice job on it. Like I said, definitely exaggerated, not quite what we see on screen, but quite cool nevertheless. And for the sake of scale comparison, I thought it'd be important to put him with one of the next generation figures, so I've chosen one of my favourites, which is the Riker, who is, to keep in mind, he is slightly taller than some of the other figures in that line, so hopefully this is a good marker for comparison. So you can see that the Borg obviously are a lot taller than the other figures in this line. They're definitely bulkier as well, broader, and much more menacing, because they do tend to tower over the other characters. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it all comes down to personal taste. I think it is very effective because it makes them much more monstrous. It makes them much more threatening to the other figures on the toy shelf. That said, it's not quite authentic to what we see on screen, because they should be roughly the same height and obviously a lot more slimline than they appear here. It's worth pointing out that Diamond Select Toys would go it alone, and a few years later they would produce their own Borg figure, which is a lot more authentic to what we see on screen. You can see he's obviously a lot more streamlined, he's a lot smaller, and yeah, he doesn't have quite as much detail going on. But as a point of comparison, it is interesting to see just how different these two figures are. And once again, bringing Riker into the mix so you have a full sense of how these figures sort of scale together. We can see that maybe the new Borg is a little bit too short, really, when compared to, say, Riker, who seems to tower above the Borg, and that probably doesn't work quite so well. There's nothing wrong, because, of course, the Borg can take any shape or size, depending on the host that they've taken over, but in terms of your figure scaling, it doesn't look quite right, whilst the Asylum Borg looks too big. So, all in all then, as a conclusion, I think this is a really fun line. I love the Borg. I'm really glad that we got some aliens in the Asylum line, and the Borg are a key favourite of mine, so I'm really glad to have these figures. Certainly, I have my criticisms. I think a little too much creative license has been allowed, so they've definitely exaggerated the Borg out of proportion, I would say, so they don't quite feel authentic to what we see on screen, and as collectors I think that's probably what we're all striving for. That said, I think a little bit of creative license is good, and we can see certainly that they have not spared any effort when it comes to the sculpting and the paint apps on these figures, which is absolutely gorgeous. I think that the head sculpts particularly are very, very menacing, and I think some of the appendages on these sort of gun arms as well are really very creepy. So I think I have to give them, top mark when it comes to sculpting and painting. I'm just not entirely convinced that this is what we really needed for this line. I think if they just dialed it back a little bit, if they're just a little bit more streamlined, a little shorter, then this would be a really fantastic collection. As it is, they feel a little bit clunky and a little bit too much. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.